Hi, my name is Jyoti Guptara, and I'm the author of Business Storytelling From Hype to Hack. Joining us now on Drucker TV is a writer who has shaped global discourse for 3 decades and counting with his high-profile columns. Adrian Wooldridge is the global business columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Before that, he worked for The Economist for 32 years. And he's the author of 11 books, most recently, The Aristocracy of Talent, How Meritocracy Made the World Modern. Adrian, thank you for joining us on Drucker TV.
Thank you for that very kind introduction.
Now, I heard through the grapevine that you, Adrian, have been a regular visitor and contributor to the Drucker Forum since its very first days. How have you observed the forum developing? What are your thoughts in general on the forum, and why do you keep coming back?
Yes, I came to the first of these forums, and I remember Richard Straub getting into contact with me before, when it was just an idea, and talking to me about it, because I'd written a very admiring piece about Drucker in The Economist. I wrote a series of profiles of management gurus, and I put him as number 1. As the sort of the guru's guru. And so Richard got in contact with me. And also I'd met Peter Drucker. I used to live in the late 1990s. I lived in Los Angeles. And one day I got a phone call from a very gruff-voiced person. I thought, this must be Henry Kissinger. But it was in fact Peter Drucker. And he invited me down to come and visit him in his house. And we went out and had lunch. So I feel as I have a certain sort of connection with Drucker. So I've come every year. And I've come every year because I've learned something. Every year, and it's got bigger and bigger and bigger, and in many ways better and better. So it's a very important part of the annual business calendar, I think.
I couldn't agree more. You write on an incredibly vast array of subjects. You recently wrote columns on everything from the military-industrial complex to the new Napoleon film by Ridley Scott, and of course politics. In your 3+ decades of writing for leading journals, how have you observed media or journalism changing? Nowadays, mainstream media, some would say legacy media, has quite poor ratings, historically low ratings, but also trust is at an all-time low in these established media outlets. Why do you think that is, and what can we do to ensure we're getting good sources of news and journalism?
Well, I'd say in response to your first point that I specialize in generalizations. So I throw generalizations out about a very wide range of things. I would say the core of good journalism has remained remarkably the same. There's been all of this noise and all of this sort of superficial change with things like Twitter and the rest of it. But what makes for a good column or a good article is still the same as it was, which is a very fresh eye that can observe the world and an inquiring intelligence which can try and make sense of the world. So if you look at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or The Economist, any of the big publications, what makes them really good is exactly the same now as it was then. You have a multiplication of platforms, but most of these platforms are either nonsense, and obviously a lot of what appears in social media is nonsense, or they're just ways in which the intellectual and reportorial advances made by the big organizations are disseminated around the place. So good journalism is exactly the same now as when I started in the business, and the best journalists are doing exactly the same thing, with the one proviso that I think we have made a big leap forward in our ability to present data in exciting and relatable ways.
Talking about data, you recently wrote a column about, you could say, surveillance capitalism. Yes. You said that knowledge workers are now panopticon.
Yes.
Prisoners, referring to monitoring technology and how managers can control them and things like that. Can you explain that to us a little more, and maybe contrast it with the sort of knowledge manager work that Peter Drucker would have liked to see?
Well, Peter Drucker argued that the knowledge manager is somebody who uses knowledge in order to understand and explain the world and to advance the managerial task. It's a quintessentially human thing. It depends on human judgment, human intuition, human relations. What we now have is a whole set of surveillance mechanisms which can monitor what we do. They can monitor our productivity. They can monitor our facial expressions. They can monitor all sorts of things.
Like whether we're on Facebook or not, when we should be.
They can look into our private lives to see what we're doing in our private lives. And I think companies may be very tempted to do that because they're very worried about getting their pound of flesh, getting the productivity numbers up. I think they'd be profoundly misguided if they do that, because I think a knowledge worker produces his or her best work when they have a sense of self-control, empowerment, and surveillance capitalism disempowers people. But there's something even more that's going on here, and that is that we have a sort of surveillance capitalism, by which I mean the big tech companies depend fundamentally on sucking up information about all of us, about our preferences, about our likes, our dislikes, our whereabouts, and using that information to sell us things, and using that information on a real-time basis to influence our behavior. So my phone knows exactly where I am, and it knows that I like reading books. So if I'm walking past a bookshop in Vienna, it might say to me, there's a bookshop, you need to go into that, you need to buy that sort of thing. So they have that sort of granular information on us. I think that's a fundamental challenge to liberal capitalism. Liberal capitalism is all about individuals as rational agents making decisions about their own future. And if we have surveillance capitalism knowing as much about ourselves as it does and using that knowledge to influence, I think it's fundamentally illiberal things. And so far in history, broadly speaking, capitalism and liberalism have advanced together. And I now think that because of these information agglomerators in Silicon Valley, capitalism is beginning to become illiberal in varying fundamental ways. And that, I think, could be a turning point in civilization.
So it's not an alliance to be taken for granted.
Absolutely.
There could be a divorce.
Absolutely. So you have powerful companies in Silicon Valley that know more about us than we know and can use that to control us in various ways. You also have this weird nexus between state power and capitalist power in China, which again is authoritarian. So I think capitalism may be moving away from a liberal phase into something that's much more worrying.
You mentioned history a moment ago, and this year's theme at the Drucker Forum is, of course, creative resilience. Yesterday I was strolling through Vienna, and you see this beautiful art and architecture and everything else that developed here. And much of it was created because of religious thought. And one of your earlier books was God is Back, how the global revival of faith is changing the world. So creativity enjoyed a heyday under religious thinkers, which comes as a surprise to many people. And personal resilience has a lot to do with people's faith as well. How do you see, has faith changed the world since the publication of your book? Or what is the connection between resilience and faith?
Well, let me say two things to answer that question. One is there's a wonderful book produced by somebody called Daniel Bell in the early 1960s, I think, called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And what that book argued was essentially that capitalism needs to draw on pre-capitalist modes of being, on essentially aristocratic or religious traditions in order to sustain its strength. And that if it becomes too capitalist, if it becomes too divorced from traditional culture, then it will lose the sort of the grit in the oyster that makes it creative. A point that actually Henry Kissinger, who unfortunately died yesterday, he was also very keen on making this point, that you need a creative tension between liberal capitalist civilization on the one hand and traditional civilization on the other to make for creativity. So I think that we should be very nervous about too much commerce and too much divorce away from traditional values. The second point that you make about the book on God is Back, on the revival of faith, I think that book was both wrong and right. It was wrong in the sense that I think that religion and religiosity have declined faster in the United States than I had expected. That the numbers of people going to church is going down. The younger generation are very anti-institutionalized religion by American standards. The second thing is that I think religion as a geostrategic force in the world has only strengthened. And we see, you know, what's happening in Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to call it at the moment, with Hamas. Hamas is an Islamic group that is motivated very strongly by a set of very fundamentalist religious beliefs. It's not just a group of people who believe in Palestinian statehood. It's a group of people who believe in Sharia law and things like that. And you can see that right across the Middle East, that religious fundamentalism is a very powerful force in politics.
Sticking with the Vienna theme, this city has produced some of the top management thinkers, whether it's managing a company or an economy. Of course, Peter Drucker hails from Vienna, but so do figures like Schumpeter and Hayek. What, if anything, do we still have to learn from these sorts of Viennese management thinkers? Well,
when Peter Drucker phoned me up, in that remarkable meeting that we had in the late 1990s, he invited me down to his house, to visit him in his house, and he also took me out to lunch in a sort of restaurant, which was, let's say, it was a very Orange County place. It had a plastic wagon wheel on the wall. All the waiters and waitresses were all dressed up as cowboys. And the food, I would say, was not particularly good. It was all fries and burgers. And he, all the way through this meeting, in which this lunch, in which these various cowboys were coming and going, was talking about being brought up in Vienna and knowing the Wittgenstein family and knowing Schumpeter, and his father knew Schumpeter, and all of the sort of Viennese circle people at that time. So he was drawing an enormous amount of intellectual energy from that 1920s and 1930s Vienna. And if you look at what Hayek did, or what Schumpeter did, or what Drucker did, we've only begun to realize the full implications intellectually of it. They were just three fundamental thinkers who got right to the heart of modernity. So if you want to understand modern capitalism, you really can't do much better than reading Schumpeter or Hayek. Or if you want to understand modern management, you can't do that much better than reading Drucker. So I think there was an extraordinary explosion of
wonderful
thought.
Note to end on. Of course, we would love to unpack that more. Adrian Wooldridge has written, as mentioned, a wonderful book, The Aristocracy of Talent. I do encourage you all to get your copy and, of course, check out Adrian's other work. Thank you so much for joining us on Drucker TV.
Thank you.